Hey, everybody, and welcome to our deep dive all about green energy. You've
Mm-hmm.
been hearing a lot about it
Yeah.
and probably even using some of it. But
Right.
is it really as green as it's made out to be?
Yeah, that's the big question.
That's what we're here to unpack.
Absolutely.
So
Yeah.
for this deep dive,
Okay.
we went beyond the headlines
Uh-huh.
and we dug into a ton of research,
Right.
interviews with industry insiders, scientists,
Yeah.
and even visited green energy projects across the U.S.
Wow. Um,
And
okay.
what we found, well, it's a bit more complicated
Yeah.
than that initial rosy picture.
I think for many of us, the journey started with genuine optimism.
Oh, yeah.
I remember feeling that excitement too.
Absolutely.
Like we were on the verge of a clean energy revolution.
I mean, who wouldn't be excited about harnessing the power of the sun and wind?
Right.
I remember building my own sustainable homestead years ago,
Wow.
all solar powered, heated with wood. I was living the dream.
Yeah.
And I was writing about it, covering all the exciting developments in sustainable living.
It felt like a real turning point, especially during the Obama era,
Oh, yeah.
when green energy got this massive boost in funding and attention.
Right.
There was a real sense that we could finally break free from fossil fuels.
Right. But one of the most jarring findings came from Richard York at the University of Oregon.
Oh, wow.
His research published in the prestigious Journal of Nature showed that simply adding non-fossil energy sources doesn't always lead to a reduction in fossil fuel use.
Really?
Yeah, so even if we're using more solar and wind, we might not actually be using less coal and oil.
That's interesting.
It is. So we saw this playing out in places like Nevada, Iowa, and North Carolina.
Mm.
While they were shutting down coal plants, they were often replacing them with natural gas plants.
Okay.
It's cleaner than coal, sure,
Right.
but still a fossil fuel.
Still a fossil fuel.
So it's not a simple one-to-one swap like we're often led to believe.
Right. And this is where Ozzie Zanner, a visiting scholar at UC Berkeley, comes in with a really thought-provoking perspective.
Oh,
He argues that this whole idea of renewables being fundamentally different from fossil fuels is an illusion.
okay. That's a pretty bold statement. What's his reasoning there?
Well, he points out that even things like solar panels and electric vehicles have hidden environmental costs. Take solar panels, for example.
Uh-huh.
People think they're made from simple sand, but the reality is much more complex.
Yeah, I've actually heard that they require high-quality quartz and coal to be melted together in these giant furnaces, which uses a ton of energy and creates significant emissions.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And then there are the rare earth metals needed for electric vehicles, which are often mined in ways that create radioactive waste.
Right.
Plus all the energy-intensive materials like aluminum and lithium used in their production.
Mm-hmm.
It all adds up.
So even at the very foundation of these green technologies, we're still deeply intertwined with the fossil fuel industry and its impacts.
That's a key takeaway here. And perhaps the most surprising revelation from our research was this. There isn't a single entity anywhere running on 100% solar and wind energy alone.
Hold on. Not even those companies that claim to be 100% renewable.
Nope. Even they are connected to the grid, relying on conventional power sources when the sun isn't shining or the wind isn't blowing.
Wow, that completely shatters the myth of energy independence that we often hear about.
Right.
So if solar and wind are so unreliable, what are we supposed to do?
Well, that brings us to the problem of intermittency.
Okay.
Solar and wind energy are, by their very nature, intermittent. They're not constantly available like fossil fuels.
Right. You can't just flip a switch and have solar power on demand, especially at night.
Exactly. And this poses a huge challenge for the grid.
Uh-huh.
To keep things running smoothly, we need backup power sources, usually natural gas plants just idling there, ready to kick in when renewables aren't producing enough.
So it's almost like having two separate energy systems running in parallel. One for when it's sunny or windy and another for when it's not.
That's a good way to put it. And that's where the idea of energy storage comes in,
Okay.
particularly batteries.
Yeah. Everyone's talking about batteries these days.
Right.
They seem like the magic solution.
They hold a lot of promise,
Yeah.
but they also come with their own set of issues.
Oh, okay.
First off, the current scale of battery production is nowhere near enough to store the vast amounts of renewable energy we'd need on a national or global scale.
So even if we wanted to go all in on batteries, we just wouldn't have enough.
Exactly. Plus, there's the environmental impact of battery production itself.
Mm-hmm.
It's very energy intensive and relies on mining, which adds to the overall carbon footprint.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's the fact that batteries have a limited lifespan. They'll eventually need to be replaced, creating another wave of environmental consequences.
It's like we're trading one set of problems for another.
Oh.
It definitely makes you think twice about that plug in and go green mantra.
Absolutely. And this is just the tip of the iceberg. We haven't even touched on one of the most controversial aspects of the green energy movement,
Hmm.
biomass.
Okay, biomass. Now, that's a topic that always sparks debate. Let's break it down. What exactly are we talking about here?
Essentially, biomass is burning organic matter, mostly wood, to generate electricity.
Right.
And what might surprise you is that it's actually the largest source of renewable energy globally.
Whoa, seriously? I thought that title belonged to solar or wind.
It's a bit misleading, isn't it? Even countries praised for their solar and wind efforts are still heavily reliant on biomass.
So what's the catch? Why is biomass so problematic?
It often gets portrayed as carbon neutral because the idea is that the trees will grow back and reabsorb the CO2 released during burning.
Yeah, that's the argument I've heard before. Sounds good in theory.
The problem is that it takes decades, even centuries, for forests to fully regenerate.
So in the short term, we're releasing a significant amount of CO2 into the atmosphere, which isn't doing us any favors in the fight against climate change.
Exactly. And it gets worse. Some biomass plants aren't even burning clean wood. We found instances where they were burning garbage creosote-treated railroad ties, even PCP-treated wood.
Hold on, that's crazy. Burning toxic waste and calling it renewable? It sounds like greenwashing on steroids.
It definitely raises some serious concerns about oversight and accountability in the industry.
And what about the public? How do people feel about burning trees for energy?
Well, based on our interviews at environmental protests, it's safe to say that citizens are largely opposed to it. They see it as just another form of environmental destruction, and honestly, it's hard to disagree with them.
But here's what I don't get. Why haven't environmental groups taken a stronger, more unified stance against biomass? Their messaging on this is often so vague with loopholes that allow these practices to continue.
It's a real head-scratcher. That lack of clarity can really undermine their credibility and create confusion among the public. But even beyond the specifics of solar, wind, or biomass, some experts are pointing to a much deeper, more systemic problem.
Okay, I'm all ears. What's this bigger issue they're seeing?
They're saying the real elephant in the room is our relentless pursuit of economic growth on a finite planet.
So it's not just about the type of energy we're using, but the sheer scale of our impact.
Exactly. Think about it. The human population has exploded over the past few centuries, fueled by, you guessed it, fossil fuels.
Right.
And along with that population growth, we've seen this dramatic increase in consumption, especially in the Western world.
It's this more is always better mentality, right?
Yeah.
But we're starting to hit the limits of what the planet can sustain.
And that's where things get really uncomfortable. We're talking about a total human impact on the planet that's now 100 times greater than it was just 200 years ago. That's a truly staggering figure.
It's almost too big to wrap your head around. So maybe the real problem isn't just about switching to renewable energy, but about addressing this fundamental disconnect between our desire for endless growth and the planet's finite resources.
That's a key insight here. We can't just swap out one energy source for another and expect everything to be fine if we don't address the root cause of our ecological crisis, our unsustainable levels of consumption.
So how do we even begin to tackle a problem that big, especially when there are such powerful forces pushing for the status quo?
Well, that leads us to another layer of complexity. Let's follow the money and see who's actually profiting from this idea that green energy will save us.
Okay, that's where things tend to get a bit murky. From what I've seen, there's some pretty powerful players involved in the green energy game.
You're right. Billionaires, banks, corporations, they're all heavily invested in the idea of a green energy revolution.
And I'm not saying all of them are bad actors, but it does make you wonder, are they truly committed to a sustainable future? Or are they just looking to profit from the latest trend?
That's the question we need to be asking. And to answer it, we need to dig a little deeper into specific examples of how these financial interests are shaping the narrative around green energy. We'll do that in part 2 of our deep dive. Be sure to join us then. Welcome back
To our deep dive into the world of green energy.
Last time we started peeling back the layers of this seeming simple question. Is green energy really as green as we're told? We found some pretty surprising and maybe even unsettling answers.
Yeah.
We talked about how adding renewables doesn't always translate to less fossil fuel use, how even clean technologies have hidden environmental costs, and how this whole idea of energy independence through solar and wind is a bit of a myth.
Yeah, and then there's the whole biomass controversy, which is just a mess of contradictions and questionable practices.
Yeah.
But what really got me thinking was that link between economic growth and our impact on the planet.
Right.
It's like we're on this treadmill that we can't get off of.
Exactly. And that brings us to the money trail. The financial interests that are shaping the narrative around green energy. Last time we started talking about billionaires, banks, and corporations investing heavily in this sector.
And it's not to say that every investment is driven by greed,
Right.
but it does make you wonder, are they truly committed to a sustainable future, or are they just looking to profit from the latest trend?
That's a valid question. And to get a better understanding, we need to look at some specific examples. Let's start with those green funds we mentioned earlier, the ones marketed as ethical and sustainable investments.
Yeah, the ones that make you feel all warm and fuzzy inside,
Right.
like you're saving the planet with every dollar you invest.
Exactly.
But when we dug into the SEC filings of some of these funds, well, let's just say the reality was quite so rosy.
One that stood out was Green Century funds.
Okay.
They're endorsed by big names in the environmental movement, like 350.org and Bill McKibben. So you'd think their portfolio would be full of solar panels, wind turbines, and other green tech.
That's what I would assume. But what did you find?
Less than 1% of their investments were actually in solar and wind.
Wow.
The vast majority was in things like mining companies, oil and gas infrastructure, even a tar sands operation.
Hold on, tar sands. That's about as far from green as you can get.
It gets worse.
Oh.
They also had investments in McDonald's,
Oh, geez.
a major driver of meat consumption, which has a huge environmental footprint. And Archer Daniels Midland, one of the world's largest producers of biofuels, which are often linked to deforestation.
Okay, I'm starting to see a pattern here, and it's not a pretty one.
It's a classic case of greenwashing, slapping a green label on something that's fundamentally unsustainable. And unfortunately, it's more common than you might think.
So it's not just Green Century funds. We found similar issues with aspiration. The Green Fund partnered with the Sierra Club.
Right. Their portfolio is full of companies like Chevron, ExxonMobil, Chesapeake Energy, and even the Russian gas giant Gazprom.
It's almost comical how blatantly they're contradicting their own mission.
Yeah.
But the real kicker, the one that blew my mind, was the Sierra Club's Green Fund's biggest holding, Inviva.
The world's largest consumer of forests for biomass.
I mean, the irony is just too much. The Sierra Club, a group that claims to protect forests, is profiting from the very industry that's cutting them down to burn for energy. It's enough to make your head spin.
It really is. And it raises some serious questions about the motivations of these environmental groups. Are they genuinely committed to protecting the planet? Or are they more interested in aligning themselves with powerful financial interests?
It's a tough pill to swallow, especially for those who have put their faith in these organizations.
Yeah.
And it gets even more complicated when you look at individuals like Al Gore.
The climate change crusader himself.
Right? Remember that powerful scene in his documentary, An Inconvenient Truth, where he's weighing the entire planet against a pile of gold bars? It was this stark visual representation of the choices we face.
But then we discovered that Gore, along with David Blood, the former CEO of asset management for Goldman Sachs, created Generation Investment Management.
Wait, Blood and Gore, that's almost too perfect.
And within their portfolio, they carved out a special category for, you guessed it, biomass and biofuels with a target investment of $650 million.
So even Al Gore, the guy who warned us about the dangers of climate change, is profiting from the burning of trees for energy. It's hard to reconcile that with his message of environmental stewardship.
It highlights the complex interplay between idealism, pragmatism, and financial interests. It seems that even the most well-intentioned individuals can get caught up in the system.
And that's what's so disheartening about all of this. It's not just a few bad apples. It's the systemic problem where financial interests are intertwined with the very solutions we're being offered. So where does that leave us? If we can't trust environmental groups and green funds to lead the way, who can we turn to?
It's a question that many are grappling with, and it leads to an even deeper level of inquiry. What if the real problem isn't just about the type of energy we use or the financial systems that support it? What if it's something even more fundamental, something rooted in our own psychology?
Okay, now you're really piquing my curiosity. What are you getting at?
Let's explore the idea that our own fear of death, our deep-seated need to believe in our own immortality, might actually be driving some of our most destructive behaviors, including our unsustainable relationship with the planet.
Whoa, that's a pretty heavy concept. But I'm willing to hear you out. How does that work?
We'll dive into that fascinating connection in part 3 of our deep dive. Be sure to join us then as we continue to explore these complex and often uncomfortable questions.
Welcome back to the deep dive.
Mm-hmm.
We've been on quite a journey, haven't we?
We have.
Exploring the complexities of green energy,
Right?
the limitations of renewables, the financial interests shaping the narrative, and even the role of biomass.
Mm-hmm.
It's a lot to process.
Yeah. And in the last part,
Yeah?
we left you with a bit of a cliffhanger.
Right.
We were about to delve into a fascinating,
Okay.
but perhaps unsettling idea: the connection between our fear of death and our unsustainable relationship with the planet.
Okay, so remind me again, how does our fear of death tie into all of this? It seems like a bit of a leap.
It might seem that way at first, but there's a compelling argument to be made here. It comes from the work of social psychologist Sheldon Solomon and his colleagues.
Okay.
They've been studying what's called terror management theory.
Terror management theory. Okay, that sounds intense.
It's basically the idea that because humans are aware of their own mortality, they develop psychological defenses to cope with that existential anxiety.
Makes sense. I mean, it's not exactly a cheery thought to dwell on the fact that we're all going to die someday.
Right. And according to this theory, one of the ways we cope with that fear is by clinging to cultural worldviews that provide a sense of meaning, order, and permanence.
So things like religion nationalism, or even our belief in progress and economic growth, things that make us feel like we're part of something bigger than ourselves, something that will outlive us.
Exactly. And here's where it gets interesting in relation to our environmental crisis. Our modern consumer culture, with its emphasis on material possessions, status symbols, and endless growth, is a powerful worldview that helps us buffer against the fear of death.
Because it distracts us from our mortality, keeps us focused on acquiring more stuff, striving for more success, believing that the system will just keep going forever.
Precisely. And the problem is that this worldview is fundamentally at odds with the reality of finite planet. We can't have infinite growth on a finite planet. It's simply not sustainable.
So we're caught in this trap.
Yeah.
We're clinging to a worldview that's ultimately destructive because it helps us manage our fear of death, even though it's pushing us closer to ecological collapse.
That's the dilemma. And what's even more troubling is that when our cultural worldview is threatened, when we're reminded of our mortality, we tend to double down on those beliefs and behaviors, even if they're harmful.
So all those environmental warnings, all the news about climate change, biodiversity loss, and resource depletion, they're actually backfiring. Instead of motivating us to change, they're making us cling even tighter to the very systems that are causing these problems.
That's a paradoxical effect. And it explains why, despite all the evidence, it's so hard to shift our collective behavior away from consumerism and towards a more sustainable way of life.
It's like we're collectively in denial about the consequences of our actions, because facing those consequences would mean confronting our own mortality.
And that's a terrifying prospect for most people. So we distract ourselves, we numb ourselves with consumption, we tell ourselves that technology will save us, that we can have it all without having to make any fundamental changes.
But deep down, we know that's not true. We know that this path is unsustainable. We know that something has to change.
And that brings us to a crucial question. If our fear of death is driving our destructive behavior, how do we break free from this trap? How do we confront our mortality in a way that empowers us to live more sustainably, more ethically, more in harmony with the natural world?
Yeah, that's the million-dollar question. Because it's not like we can just switch off our fear of death. It's a fundamental part of the human condition.
Absolutely. But what we can do is become more aware of how that fear is influencing our choices, our behaviors, our relationship with the planet.
So it's about becoming more conscious of our mortality, not trying to deny it or escape from it.
Exactly. Because paradoxically, it's often in facing our mortality that we find the courage and the motivation to live more meaningful, more purposeful lives.
It's like that saying, live each day as if it were your last.
Right.
But instead of using that as an excuse to be reckless or indulgent, use it as a reminder to appreciate what truly matters, to make choices that align with our values, to leave a positive impact on the world.
That's a beautiful way to put it. And it brings us back to the heart of our deep dive into green energy. It's not just about the technology, the economics, or even the politics. It's about our values, our worldview, our understanding of our place in the web of life.
It's about recognizing that we're not separate from nature, but part of it, and that our actions have consequences not just for ourselves, but for all living things.
It's about shifting from a mindset of fear and scarcity to one of interconnectedness and abundance.
And it's about finding the courage to live in a way that honors the precious gift of life, both our own and that of all the other beings we share this planet with.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, we leave you with a challenge. To confront your own mortality, not with fear, but with curiosity and a sense of possibility.
To question the dominant narratives that are driving our unsustainable behaviors.
To imagine a future where our relationship with the planet is one of respect, reciprocity, and reverence.
And to start making choices both big and small that reflect those values.
Because the real solutions to our ecological crisis lie not in technological fixes, but in a profound transformation of our hearts and minds.
Thanks for joining us on this journey of discovery. We hope it sparks some new insights, some challenging questions, and maybe even a renewed sense of hope for the future. And for our listeners across the globe, if you enjoyed this deep dive,
Please like and subscribe.
until next time, stay curious and keep questioning everything.